girls said at the same time. Good. He dumped 25 points into that skill to bring it up to 40. He always felt a little zap of life when he added to vitality, and more powerful when he increased his strength. With dexterity, he couldn't perceive any change. Here's the plan, he said. We'll see what we're up against. If he seems too powerful, you two will come at him from two different sides, distracting him. I'll steal the item, and we'll bolt. What's the signal for us to leave? Olivia asked. A whistle. Nicoletta shook her head so harshly that her hair tumbled free from her ponytail, and she had to fix it. I can't whistle. You can't? Gary couldn't believe it. I taught myself. Good for you, but I can't, and I need to. Hoot like an owl, Olivia suggested. I'll be the judge if we have to go or not, Gary said. So you're the boss? Nicoletta crossed her arms. I don't think so. I agree with Nicoletta. Olivia put her back to Nicoletta and mimicked her stance. You're going to pull one of those macho tough guy acts and get yourself killed. I heard that if you die in the game, you lose 10 levels. I heard that points are stripped, Nicoletta said. That's not going to happen, Gary said firmly. We'll be fine if we work together. Worst comes to worst, I'll swipe the item. Remember, no one is dying. Olivia winked, grinning broadly. That's the kind of thinking I like, Pumpkin. She patted his cheek and skipped a few paces down the tunnel. She's gonna get herself killed, Nicoletta commented. She's a fighter, he murmured. I just hope that if she pukes again, that it doesn't land on me this time. Oh, Nicoletta said faintly. Gary tried to grin, but failed. You ready? Maybe. Come on. He placed his hand on the small of her back, and they hurried to catch up to Olivia. Chapter 18. Abruptly, the tunnel widened into a large cavern. Instead of the ground being solid stone, it was made of rocks and pebbles that slid around. Gary inched forward. In the middle of the room was a tall pedestal. The ceiling above them stretched endlessly high, and he couldn't see any bats or vultures or any other creature, winged or footed. Something isn't right, Olivia whispered. She was spot on. Movement to the left revealed a man wearing a cloak standing by the wall and another opening, just like the one they had passed through to reach this point. He was holding his hand up toward the ceiling, examining something small and red, the runed ruby. Gary couldn't help himself. He rushed forward and then hesitated, but at that point, the girls had started to follow him. The man immediately snapped his long fingers into a tight fist that he slowly lowered to his side. Leave me be, he said coldly, in a voice that brooked no arguments. Yeah, not happening, Gary said. You aren't getting away with that, Nicoletta ordered. Go be a villain somewhere else, Olivia added. The man laughed and swept his other arm back, causing his cloak to flutter behind him, the billowing material almost looking like a wing. You want this? He held up his fist. Come and get it. How original, Nicoletta muttered as she grabbed her twin daggers. Olivia had her spear, a real metal one that she had bought and was wielding with decent proficiency. Gary, of course, had his sword. He debated yanking out his dagger, too, but if he needed to steal the ruined ruby instead of killing the man for it, he would need at least one hand free. Ideally, the dagger would be his preferred weapon in this scenario so Gary could fight close quarters, but he had no idea how powerful this guy was. He had no one else with him, no team. Clearly, he had no powers. So the longer reach would keep Gary at a distance, even if it would make stealing more difficult. Maybe it was his added dexterity, or maybe he was just that furious that someone might swipe the artifact right under their nose. But Gary ran faster than he had since so long ago when he'd won races. He reached the man first, and Gary went to slash with his blade when a terrible gust of wind blew him back so far that he collided with the girls. Nicoletta recovered first. Her face was bright red, full of anger. She held up her hands, which glowed slightly. Her fire? Was she willing to use it? Was the firecracker trying to overcome her fear? Before a flame could appear, the man threw out his hand, and a thin tendril of water flew out, coating her hands and causing the fire to diminish to black smoke. Wait, so the man had both air and water? What level was he? As if she didn't want to be outdone by Nicoletta, Olivia took flight. Of course, with the guy exploiting wind, that didn't work out well for her. In fact, he slammed her against the wall so hard that a crack echoed. The man laughed maniacally as Gary and Nicoletta rushed over to Olivia. Nicoletta forced the unconscious woman to drink a potion, and Olivia stirred. "We have to try and fight him," she said. Nicoletta nodded. "I don't see a weapon on him. If we can get in close, maybe you can swipe it." "We can do this." Olivia stood and nearly collapsed onto Gary. "Are you okay?" he asked her. She shook her head and cracked her knuckles. "More than okay." Gary wasn't so sure, but the air in the room was beginning to spin faster and faster. The guy was trying to make a tornado. Pebbles gathered to join the funnel. Desperate, Gary shoved away his sword, grabbed his dagger, and whipped it at the man. Of course, the man used more wind to knock the blade to the side, but Gary was already closing the distance between them. Before the man could blast him, Gary had tackled him. A gust of wind slammed into Gary, causing him to fly backward. Nicoletta dashed over to Gary's place, her twin daggers crossed to form an X. She slashed and sliced at the man, but he seemed to float above the ground, moving away from her without walking. Abruptly, the man placed his hand on her chest, and the stench of burnt clothes and flesh seared Gary's stomach. He thought he would hurl as Nicoletta collapsed to her knees and then lay face first on the ground. Rage filled Gary, and he tried once more. The man formed a small fireball in his hand that connected with Gary's dagger. The hilt immediately grew too hot for him to handle, and he dropped the weapon as the blade melted. The heat, that power, the commands this man had. Olivia was right. He was a villain, or even a supervillain. But if he was a supervillain, he was holding back on purpose to toy with them. Nicoletta was lying there, not moving. Gary darted over to her and dragged her back slightly. He started to give her a potion when he heard Olivia scream. Gary whirled around to see the man lowering his arm from clearly having backhanded her. Olivia staggered back before trying to stab him. He gripped the spear in his hands to block the blow, and in seconds, the metal glowed as red as his hands. Olivia had to release her hold on it. And that was when the man began to attack with a weapon instead of his powers. He viciously jabbed toward Olivia in a blatant attempt to impale the woman with her own spear. But Gary lunged across the distance and just barely used the tip of his sword to block the blow. The man nodded to Gary, and the two fought in earnest. The jabbing nature of the spear made fighting him with the sword awkward and unnatural. But then again, Gary wasn't super proficient with sword fighting, so maybe that helped him, considering he wasn't thrown off as someone who would have trained for years. The foe was as deadly with a weapon as with his power, and Gary was suffering. A slash to his upper thigh, a cut to his bicep, a massive bruise when the guy jerked his feet out from under him. Gary didn't know how he managed to bring up his sword to block off what would have been a finishing blow, but he did, and then rolled away and jumped to his feet. Gary was breathing hard. The cave had been chilly all along, but now he was dripping with sweat, and he wiped his forehead. The last thing he would need would be for sweat to drip into his eyes and blind him momentarily. Blood dripped from the cut on his bicep. Thankfully, it wasn't trickling down his arm to his wrist gripping the weapon, but it was making the ground slick. Gary had no choice but to watch his footing more carefully, which meant his attention wasn't on the man as much as it should have been, and the man took advantage with a sharp whack to the side of Gary's head. Gary went down hard. His vision was spotty, growing dim, and a roaring sound filled his ears. Had he dropped his sword? Yes, but where was it? Where were the girls, for that matter? Dazed, he sat back and watched as the man raised the spear, the metal glowing red-hot. He jerked down toward Gary when all of a sudden, Nicoletta was there, holding the spear, and not being burned. Olivia rushed over to Gary's side and helped him up. Her lips moved, but he couldn't hear what she was saying above the roar still overwhelming his ears. Just then, the man jabbed the spear toward Olivia. Gary tried to shove her out of the way at the same time that Olivia took flight, and Gary staggered forward to slam into the pedestal. The platform wasn't that steady. It didn't support him at all. But instead of breaking, the dais shook a bit and then started to descend into the ground, accompanied by loud grumbling that finally sounded over the ringing. The ground shook as if from an earthquake, and hundreds of snakes descended from the ceiling. Olivia shrieked and tumbled from her flight right onto the man. The spear was still red hot, somehow back in their foe's hand. The metal burned Olivia, maybe even punctured her, and she collapsed to the ground. Her hands shook as she tried to reach for a potion. The man went in for the kill, but massive bats with human faces swooped around, also falling from the ceiling, their fangs like that of vampires, and they tried to bite and tear into him. And only him. Because of the ruined ruby still clutched in his grubby paws? Gary rushed over to Olivia and handed her a potion while glancing around. The ground was still shaking, and a massive two-headed bear had lumbered into the cave from the second entrance. Each step the bear took caused the earth to quake all the more. This was the stuff of nightmares. All that was missing would be a dragon. A burst of fire appeared high overhead. When the smoke dissipated, a fully sized dragon descended, with massive green-black wings and a golden underbelly. The dragon took up the vast majority of space above them. Considering how commodious the area was, that was saying something. Thankfully, the dragon and most of the creatures seemed to be going after the man, which gave Gary enough time to find Nicoletta. Her face was covered in ashes and soot as she picked herself up off the ground. She was bleeding, her clothes torn, but she stalked toward the man as if she was ready to set him ablaze. With a wild shrill, she tackled him, forcing him to the ground. The ruined ruby fell out of his grasp, and one of the snakes from the ceiling snatched it. The man went to yank on the snake, but another one bit his hand. The creatures were attacking the man. The man wasn't a supervillain, at least not in the sense of the game. The man had to be another player. He kicked Nicoletta straight in the face. She staggered back, right in Gary's arms. He dragged her over to Olivia, and the three of them limped away, back the way they had come. The cave tunnels had repopulated with more bears, snakes, and vultures. Gary had to handle most of them, and even though he had managed them relatively easily previously, now his body was aching and his reflexes were slower. Worse, he had left his sword behind, so he had to use his dagger. The close quarters meant that he was almost bitten several times, and one bear got a nasty swipe against his ribs. Eventually, though, they tumbled outside and lumbered across the field to the town. The girls drank potions and healed before his eyes. Olivia wordlessly handed one to Gary. He accepted it, but didn't drink. She appeared too tired to say a word, hugged them both, and logged off. Nicoletta handed Gary his sword. In the mad dash out of there, she must have picked it up. Gary wasn't even sure when exactly he had lost it. "That was intense," she said slowly. "That's one word for it. We all almost died." She brushed some hair from his forehead and examined a cut near his temple. "We're survivors. We can't go back after that treasure." "We don't have to," he said, all the while thinking, "I have to." "Not without a larger party," she continued. "I don't think Jorge will be much help." "I might know someone," he said. His head was pounding, and he just wanted to sleep. "You need to rest and recover." "You sure?" She glanced at the potion and then away. "I'll be fine," he said. "I don't... If you're positive..." "You don't what?" he asked. "Don't believe me? Don't think I'm sane? Don't want to deal with me and my issues?" His last girlfriend had said that when she broke up with him. She claimed he had suffered long-term trauma because of all the loss he had suffered. Maybe that was true. He could always ask Olivia. She would know about that psychological stuff. But for right now, the main issue he had wasn't the same ones that girlfriend had been talking about. Now the problems were life and death in a game setting where some of the enemies had superpowers. How in the world was he going to continue to survive unless he could gain superpowers himself? Chapter 19. Nicoletta swallowed hard. "I don't want to leave you," she said softly. Gary was moved. "Ah, is someone worried about me?" "Yes,